All right, is everybody ready to get started? Okay. So to kick things off, I'm just going to talk a little bit about a few upcoming events. And if this is your first one with us, welcome. We're a educational nonprofit that does all kinds of events throughout Central Texas and San Antonio, helping people overcome mycophobia, understand the importance of the mushroom kingdom, and really connect. So some of the events we have coming up is you can learn how to grow mushrooms in containers in Leander with Chuck Stryker. And then we have a extraction workshop over at Live Oak Brewery in Austin. And then our special guest speaker this month is an artist in San Antonio. We're going to be doing watercolor. So it's going to be in San Antonio, but we'll have the live stream set up. And if you want to watercolor from home and learn what inspires her and what helps her connect to this topic of art and watercolor, join us. And so we also, Joseph is here today. He's our volunteer coordinator for the block program. Who here has picked up mushroom blocks from us? Oh, yes. Yay. Okay, so we brought some today too. So grab some for your garden. Like right now, this time of year, they're great for mulching your plants, like helping retain moisture in the soil. So give your plants some love. Even if you don't have a garden, you can put them in your apartment complex or a park nearby. Like we just want to keep all that organic matter out of the waste stream. And so we've learned over since we've started the program over 2 years ago now, we've kept about 40,000 tons of organic matter out of the trash. And one of the farms that we work with, it helped them get their Series B, which means they're a corporation that's trying to do better with environmental stewardship and that sort of stuff. So us helping them do all this composting, it's possible. It just takes people power and people enthusiastic about these endeavors. So go see Joseph and grab some blocks on your way out. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, not too much. These are some of my Melfies. You can follow me in my mushroom adventures on forage.atx. But I like to tell people, I'm an enthusiast. I'm not an expert in any way. A lot of like what I learn is like kind of, and what I'm sharing is like me educating myself, right? And I want to share what I've learned with everyone else. And so I worked in tech for a long time, and one of my jobs was to like distill things down, like ferment it down and make it digestible, like these complex tech things. So I did like experience design, like helping people navigate all this complicated stuff. And so whenever I was kind of trying to understand mycophobia, like why are people so phobic of mushrooms? Like it just didn't make sense to me because I didn't grow up that way, thankfully. I dug into things and sort of did this fermentation of distilling things down to provide to you all. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And so in the first part, if you made it to the last talk that we did here, it's also recorded online if you want to watch it. We looked at ancient art, and we took a mushroom trip all over the world and looked at all of these sort of artifacts and looked at like polytheistic tribes and civilizations all over the world, including early Christians who used mushrooms and plants in their religious practices. And we learned about like how the sacred mushrooms were used in these rituals to commune and find harmony with the planet. And they were reflected in the way they illustrated these things in caves and early art. So today I'm going to focus on the sort of period that gets us into the war on drugs. But before we get started, we're going to learn about what is this concept? What is early chemistry, alchemy? How did this arrive to the Western world and then eventually North America? And so we'll learn how the war on nature is a tool by the ruling class to main power. We'll look at artifacts from these same polytheistic religions and how they eventually got replaced by monotheistic ones. I'm going to explain how alchemy was introduced into Europe and how monotheistic religions took shape, leading to the Crusades and then Western colonialism. We'll continue into the 60s and 70s in the US, where the war on drugs was codified. Then into the 21st century, we'll look at how mushrooms are used in contemporary art, movies, video games, and more. And we'll see how the spiritual was replaced with the material and the collective consciousness was replaced with individualism, and art as a commodity grew out of this paradigm. So we'll see how sacred mushrooms are portrayed subversively as a rebellion against the ruling class. So in order to understand this, we have to understand how drugs or medicine came to what they are today. And so the precursor to chemistry and medicine is called alchemy. And so alchemy existed in ancient Greece, North Africa, Asia, the Middle East, long before it arrived to Europe during the medieval period. And each country had different names for it and techniques, but what they had in common was their direct relationship with nature through healing, the art of healing. In Egypt, alchemy was a great art gifted by Thoth, the god of language, math, and science. The Greeks further declared him the inventor of astronomy, astrology, the science of numbers, mathematics, geometry, surveying, medicine, botany, theology, civilized government, the alphabet, reading, writing, oratory, so many things. And they further claimed he was the true author of every work of every branch of knowledge, human and divine. So these are just some different depictions of Thoth. And I think the middle one you can see in the Brooklyn Museum in New York. So when the Roman Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, he gained access to all of Egypt's artifacts and secrets. This included the famous emerald tablets and 42 Hermetic scrolls created some 38,000 years ago in an ancient Phoenician language. They were found in the tomb of Heliopolis, where he placed the scrolls in a sacred archive and put the emerald tablets on public display. And construction of the city of Alexandria and the famous library to house and study these Hermetic texts it began immediately. He assembled a panel of priests and scholars to prepare translations. So he was the sort of, I like to say, kind of the open source tech bro of his time. And so the ancient emerald tablets and Hermetic scrolls were said to include the secrets of the universe, including alchemy, astrology, philosophy, geography, medicine, theology, and music texts. And the tablets were known to contain what is called the philosopher's stone, or the elixir of life, useful in rejuvenation or achieving immortality. And Hermetic philosophy teaches that all things come from one thing, the prima materia, which is a web of being and spirit. And as time went on, the emerald texts were translated into Latin, and the philosopher's stone was interpreted as a formula that could transmute any base metal into gold. And this was eventually the most sought after gold in alchemy when it reached Europe. And so Hermes is considered to be a combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. And he is purported author of the Hermetica. And so you can see him in a couple of different, like a floor mosaic in a cathedral, and a replica of an engraving that shows a lot of the alchemical symbols, the sun, moon, and fire. And so European alchemy was a mixture of science, philosophy, and mysticism. The art was filled with a lot of esoteric symbolism, The prominence that it gave to the idea of influencing or controlling nature led many scientists to look to magic and its allied arts, such as astrology, which is thought could put nature to the test by means of doing experiments. And there was no formal scientific method, so there were a lot of diverging texts, and some alchemists and their apprentices would accidentally die experimenting with different elixirs, trying to find gold.
What is that table?
Those are alchemical symbols. And so
Was it arranged? Was that originally, because it looked like the periodic table of the elements? Is that what you're
I think it
saying?
might have been derived from that a little bit, but that's actually a modern artist put those together.
They were.
So he might have taken the design from the periodic table. So in the medieval period in Europe, fungi was still classified in both the plant and animal kingdoms, and it was a great mystery. Alchemists in the Middle Ages sought to find the secret of creation of life from elixirs of mushrooms, minerals, plants, and even animals during their experiments. And there were many books on alchemy published at the time, including this one by the famous German Faust, which compares the power of chemical science to a double-edged sword, powerful and dangerous in the wrong hands. And so Faust is famous in history for selling his soul to the dark side. So you may have heard of the expression of Faustian bargain, which means it's a pact when a person trades something of supreme moral or spiritual importance, such as a personal value, or the soul for something that's material and very worldly, such as knowledge, power, or riches. And so choosing between this binary of good versus evil became a very common theme. And you'll see as we sort of look at different art and we look at the war on drugs, this kind of binary thinking took shape, and it really gained dominance during the early Christian religions as they became more prominent. And so now alchemy is mostly accepted as a precursor to modern chemistry, and many of the processes from this time are still used. And so the center symbol, or the staff of, which is the staff of Hermes, is the symbol for modern medicine. And you can see how it is derived from a lot of this very early religious art, which we looked at in the first talk. And so as the Crusades in Europe continued, the obsession with the quest for gold, good and evil, and the expulsion of demons were found all over art. There are only a few examples that include fungi because it was largely ignored, but these are some anonymous engravings from the 1600s, expulsion of demons, and they're a classic example of alchemical initiation of having your demons baked out of your head into a billowing cloud containing universal elements and an expanding consciousness. And so there's the one on the right that, to the left, I think that someone thought it looked like mushrooms, but you never know. And so in this illustration from the Book of Lambspring, we see a man intoxicated on Amanita muscaria mushrooms. He clutches one mushroom in his hand as he dances about holding his other hand in his forehead, as if the revelations are too intense. And so behind him is a tree that grows with a spotted mushroom on the top, known to be the fly agaric. And so we see another fresco from France of Adam and Eve at the tree of life. So very kind of similar motifs. And so Arabic translations were eventually translated to Latin in the Middle Ages, and a translation by Sir Isaac Newton is found in his alchemical papers that are currently housed at Cambridge. And so these translations and knowledge being brought from Northern Africa and the Arab world brought Europe out of the dark ages into the age of discovery. And so Carl Jung, the famous psychologist that spent a lot of time trying to understand the subconscious, identified the emerald tablets with a table made of green stone, which he encountered in the first of his set of dreams and visions. And he describes them in his writing, Seven Sermons of the Dead. He also famously said, for the alchemist, the one primarily in need of redemption is not man, but the deity who is lost and sleeping in matter. And so he's trying to say that God is in everything. That's my interpretation. And so Jung interpreted the emerald tablets as something that was achieved through a higher consciousness, not something material, as a formula for turning base metal into gold. He believed these writings pronounced a universal knowledge and a story of our connection to the one being, which is expressed in all beings, something that does not gel with, or did not gel with, the monotheistic religions that were gaining dominance at the time. And so the famous ethnobotanist and consciousness guru Terence McKenna agrees. He calls the tablets a formula for a holographic matrix that is mirrored in the human mind and offers mankind its only hope for future survival. And so the ancients clearly possessed a genuine science of consciousness, which is really about understanding dark matter. The ancients compared this to the veil of ignorance that must be pierced to allow light of consciousness to shine through. And in Vedic or Indian alchemy, which is called Veda, this could not be achieved through materialism. And so to this day, it's a great mystery to where the emerald tablets and alchemical texts are hidden and the contents of the Philosopher's Stone. And like Jung and Terence McKenna, some believed it was immaterial, and the tablets were supposedly buried at the time when scholars were imprisoned, and library, including the Alexandria, was burned by religious zealots during the Roman conquest. And so since there wasn't a formal sort of scientific process or peer review like we know today, the practice led to a lot of division. Alchemy became associated with the so-called occult. It was considered heresy and banned by the Catholic Church. Galileo was even convicted of heresy for resurrecting the old Greek Copernicus theory that the earth revolved around the sun. And since Christianity and Judaism are paternal religions, they came into power after overcoming maternal religions. And the Catholic Church thought of Galileo's heliocentrism as the revival of a maternal religion, which it implies that Mother Earth moves by itself and makes the sun, the symbol of Father God, would fall. So the English crown, also fearing the potential devaluation of gold should the Philosopher's Stone actually be discovered, made penalties for alchemy very severe. And as you can see, this was clearly about consolidation of power, and alchemy was forced underground. And so we know about Joan of Arc being burned at the stake in the witch trials that were held all over Europe and in the US. And some scholars believe that these so-called witches were hallucinating and connecting by using or accidentally consuming a fungus called ergot, which grows on wet rye. And so it contains the lysergenic acid, which is the precursor for LSD. And so nearly all of the accusers in the Salem village in the western part of it, there's known to be a region, and someone did I think their PhD or their thesis on studying the grasses and the rye in this region and looking to see if it would have been possible for them to all be consuming the fungus ergot. And so psychotropic mushrooms and herbs were used in beer, or what is known as gruit ales, until 1516, when the German government and the Holy Roman Empire implemented the Bavarian purity laws, or Reinheitsgebot. And so this required that barley, hops, which are a sedative, and water only be used in beer. And so this stamp was issued in 1983, commemorating the 450th anniversary, and they were strictly enforced in many parts of Europe. And before the purity order, one ingredient used in beer were psychedelic mushrooms, the fly agaric mushroom, which was widely used in pagan rituals that we learned about in the first part, in different parts of Europe and Asia. They offered a natural, easily accessible way to a transcendental, mystical awakening. And not only that, but magic mushrooms, literally, as we learn from some of the research that continues to be done, that it actually expands your neural pathways and increases a person's cognitive power. And that's something that did not, again, gel with the church at the time. And so in 1986, the purity laws were finally overturned. That's a long time of only having like a few things in your beer. So over the past several years, there has been an explosion of beers of all types and edible mushrooms and other ingredients. And so just recently, Jester King, which is just up the street, they added cordyceps and did a cordyceps beer. And when I first did this talk like 3 years ago, there were only like 200 mushroom beers. And I went to Untapped and like searched mushroom beer, and now there's 582. So we're getting somewhere. And that doesn't include plants too. So there's so many cool plants that people are putting in their beverages, and learning the medicinal properties and whatnot. So from the conquest of Northern Africa also came early star maps. And so the oldest accurately dated star map appeared in ancient Egyptian astronomy in 1534 BC. The astrolabe, an early instrument that was handheld model of the universe, was introduced to Europe. Europeans began traveling far distances across seas and oceans, and they created a version for maritime travel. So the monarchies and the Roman Catholic Church, who had the money and power, controlled who had access to star maps and sea routes, and Western colonization began. And Europeans began to prosper off the resources and labor of people in other parts of the world. So colonization in the New World begins. And so as we learned in part one, the sort of magic mushrooms or the flesh of gods have been used for centuries and by many indigenous people around the world. And in pre-Columbian time, before the Spanish arrived, frescoes found in Teotihuacan depicted a paradise and a mountain of abundance. And these fungi appear in Aztec statues like the one here representing Xochipilli. And so I really dig into a lot of these artifacts in the first part. So if this part of the world interests you, you can see some other art from that period. And so when the Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mesoamerica in 1519, they believed the mushrooms used in the sacred rituals allowed the Aztecs to communicate with devils. They made it easy to justify the deaths of many native people that were killed and tortured and killed by disease during this time. And so here is a 17th century painting of the fall of the Aztec Empire, likely painted just looking at the style by someone, a Spanish a conquistador. So now we're going to go back to Europe. And so before we had like photography, Facebook, mushroom identification groups, and DNA sequencing, botanical illustrations, song, poetry, and folk wisdom is how people learned to correctly identify mushrooms. And if you were royalty, you had your own botanical illustrator. So Claude Aubry was a French illustrator and botanical artist, King Louis the Great, and his mushroom paintings date back from 1730. And Aubry created nearly 800 drawings in return for little recognition of his artistry. And so a select portion of these illustrations were published in 2010 by University of Chicago Press. And so here's two illustrations from an 1800s field guide that incorrectly identified the death cap, the Amanita phalloides, and it identified it as Amanita mappa, which contains almost no toxins. And so to the right, you see a poem that was written by Meg Beagle. And so with people only being able to see these illustrations, there still were poisonings. And so in the 17th and 18th centuries, several historical figures died from eating death caps by accident or assassination. And so here are some of the famous people that died during that period and created a lot of phobia. One of the Roman emperors, and you can dig into, if you're interested in reading about some of these characters and how they died, I'm sure there's a whole books and things like that on some of these incidents because they're pretty famous. And so shortly after Charles XVI's death from a meal of mushrooms, the War of Austrian Succession broke out, and many of the borders changed in this part of the world. And so the famous French philosopher Voltaire is quoted saying, "A dish of mushroom changed the destiny of Europe." And so these famous deaths in Europe led to an intense culture of mycophobia in Western Europe. The fear of accidental poisoning appeared to have cast doubt over the nutritional value of mushrooms. The language used around mushrooms was often viscerally hostile, drawing upon images of filth and waste. Several writers referred to them as excrements of the earth, or a bundle of putrefaction arising of a cold, moist, vicious matter of the earth. And so the Victorian world still expressed deep ambivalence towards fungi, even though children's fairy stories are populated with innocent versions of the fly agaric, with toadstools and pixies dancing, as you can see here. And the popular genre of that deals with the underworld and fairies and elves, and so European superstition routinely warned against entering the fairy ring. And if you dare enter the ring, many myths warn you will die young. You also become invisible to the mortal world, unable to escape the ring, or you're transported instantly into the fairy realm. And so every culture had these slightly different superstitions. And so this spooky fairy ring painting is by George Cruikshank, and he illustrated the first English translation of Grimm's fairy tale. And so this romantic genre associated with romantic literature at the time provided a sense of escapism, and many artists painted scenes from the popular Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. There's some famous paintings from that time. And so Disney even got into the fairy game in 1914 with the Fantasia film, and at the time considered a masterpiece in animation and composition. And it featured dancing hippos, fairies, and mushrooms to the music by Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite. And so it's the animators have shared that their inspiration for the movement is based on the Three Stooges, which is kind of weird. I'm sorry, can't hear the sound that good. Right. Disney getting in on that fairy ring action. So modern science can explain fairy rings. The mycelium of a fungus growing in the ground absorbs nutrients by the secretion of enzymes from its tips called the hyphae. And this breaks down the larger molecules in the soil into smaller and smaller pieces. And once it absorbs all of the sort of organic matter in that area, it needs to reproduce and create more spores. So that's why you get the fairy ring. So there's some fairy rings that have been found kind of like a mile wide. And so I kind of describe it as like an external stomach too. Like the mycelium is kind of like eating, expanding, but it just can be like ever expanding. And that's why it's underneath our feet while we walk everywhere. And so around this same period of art, Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll was written. And it included the famous illustration of a mushroom larger than humans. And much debate over the type of mushroom has gone on through the centuries. And it's now known that John Tenniel, the book's illustrator, did not have a scientific background, but his inspiration from the drawing in the magazine Punch, which he worked for at the time, he would draw the Pope as a caterpillar, which I think is pretty cool too. Just thinking about the cordyceps, like eating the Pope as a caterpillar, that's exciting. And so to the right is a photo from Tim Burton's more recent Alice in Wonderland movie, where we see the mushroom is now an Amanita muscaria, more clearly defined. And so we now know why, it's been confirmed. People have found that it's documented that a few days before writing Alice in Wonderland, the author Carroll made his only ever visit to the Bodleian Library, where a copy of Mordecai Cook's recently published drug survey, The Seven Sisters of Sleep, had been deposited. And so the copy that he had checked out was missing the chapter on the fly agaric mushroom, or the Amanita muscaria. So don't do this. Don't do that at this library. And so Carroll was particularly interested in all things Russian. And in fact, Russia was the only country he had ever visited outside of Britain. And so we learned in the last talk about these ancient cultures in Siberia and Scandinavia, that part of the world, they consumed the Amanita muscaria, and it made them feel big and it made them feel like flying. So you can see how this kind of metaphor was incorporated into Alice in Wonderland book. And so now we're getting to talking about the culinary arts and mushroom ketchup. So criminalization and use of substances from Mordecai Cook's book continued through the Victorian period. And mycophobia and misunderstanding of mushrooms really didn't change until the French introduced mushrooms in haute cuisine. And this was imported into the US during the early colonial period. And so mushrooms were only used as a condiment and were used to make ketchup. And it was purported that it was a favorite of the author Jane Austen. And so Gia Watkins, which I brought today for everyone to try, was the most popular mushroom ketchup at the time. And it's also known as on Instagram as the Victorian umami. And it's still used in the UK, and it was featured in the Downton Abbey cookbook. And it can still be bought online today. And so I think it kind of tastes like Worcestershire. So it kind of makes sense that that became a thing, maybe more easily producible. But tomatoes weren't even used in ketchup until the 1830s. And so I'm going to continue to talk about this because it kind of does get into the talking about drugs and sort of alchemy, right? And so it was sold as a popular message. And in 1934, Dr. John Cook Bennett claimed his recipe could cure diarrhea, indigestion, scurvy, jaundice, rheumatism, maybe a few of those things on there, the scurvy for sure. Due to these false claims, the mushroom medicine catch-up empire of the time collapsed, and that's when Heinz kind of filled in the gap. Like they came in with less bogus claims, and they became the more popular ketchup in this part of the world. And so as America's interest in mushroom grew, entire cookbooks were devoted to them. And one of the first English language mushroom cookbooks was by Kate Sargent. It's 100 Mushroom Receipts. It was published in 1899. And so receipts is just the name they used at the time for recipes. So if you cook something, make sure you have the receipts. Prove that you cooked it. So there's some really fun kind of Harry Potter sounding recipe names, and this is in the public domain. So if anybody's really into mycophagy, I have the PDF, so I can get it to you. You can just email me. And so in the book's introduction, Sargent describes the changing American attitudes towards mushrooms at the turn of the century. And so the general opinion in this country regarding mushrooms has been that, with one or two exceptions, all form of fungus growth are either poisonous or unwholesome. But it is very gratifying to observe the change that is rapidly taking place in the public mind. And so, for people to think that everything's poisonous, it's kind of silly, because there's only, in Central Texas, there's only one. It's like very, very rare to find it. There's some that are toxic, like a few that are pretty toxic, but they won't kill you. But yeah, there's only about like 12 fatal mushrooms, I believe.
In the world?
In the world, yeah. Yeah, and so the science of mycology was developing, and devoted amateurs were out in a field in the woods collecting, but popular antipathy and misunderstanding of fungi still dominated the sentiment. Fungi were still classified in the animal or plant kingdom. Amateur mycologists at the time also did their own scientific illustrations, like these from a French scientific illustrator, Adolphe Milot. And this is a very popular poster that you can still buy online. And there's all kinds of prints on bags, and you can probably find bed sheets with this print. Just about everything, I'm sure. And so children's book author and illustrator Beatrix Potter of Peter Rabbit fame was also a close observer of many details of nature, focused perhaps less notably on the secret world of fungi and lichens. And so at a time when women had no right to vote and virtually no access to higher education, very rarely owned property, and were considered themselves property of their husbands, Potter became a commercially successful writer and artist, and used the royalties from her book to purchase her famed hilltop farm. So Ernst Haeckel was a famous German biologist who discovered and described thousands of new species, mapped a genealogical tree relating all life forms, and coined many terms in biology. And this was around the time when the microscope was invented, and his interpretations are very surreal and allowed for a more abstract detail that had never been seen before. And so this brings me to the next period of art. We're going to talk about Surrealism. And so during this period of art, it started to react to the ruling class that had brought on World War II. And so in a revolt against society ruled by rational thought, the Surrealists tapped into the sort of superior reality of the subconscious, painting unnerving, illogical scenes, many times mixing the real with the unreal, And here are a few artists that I really liked their paintings, and I thought they had kind of fungal shapes. So that's just like my interpretation. So Toyen, born Maria Sermanova, was a key member of the Czechoslovakian Surrealist movement, and born female, he referred to himself in the masculine gender, which is why he is named Toyen, which can be parsed in Czech as she's, he. And to the left, Toyen depicted a cluster of fungi, perhaps oyster mushrooms, emerging from the cracks in the wall near a sketched outline of a fox whose foot is strangling a blue bird at the wall's base. And in the second painting to the right, you can see a very realistic painting of morels with surreal floating hands and a tissue. So I say this is how I felt about the last few years of morel hunting in Texas. So the Surrealist movement was very male dominated and often regarded as sexist, and it began to attract many women and became much more gender balanced as time went by, although many surrealists were forced underground during the Nazi occupation during the Second World War. And so many artists worked as illustrators, and here is an example from a Soviet children's magazine, Merzilka, from 1924. And the illustration shows anthropomorphized Amanita muscaria mushrooms with text that translates to, we are coming, we'll exterminate the entire bourgeoisie. And you can buy this shirt in non-Soviet visuals. And so mushrooms were disturbingly used as a metaphor in anti-Semitic propaganda. So Der Giftpilz, the Poisonous Mushroom, is a children's book published by Julius Streicher in 1938. And the title alludes to how just as it is difficult to tell a poisonous mushroom from an edible mushroom, it is difficult to tell a Jew apart from a Gentile. And so the anti-Semitic book wanted to warn the children of the dangers. So yeah, boo. So during World War II, many African Americans were segregated fighting on the front lines, and the US states still enforced apartheid, also known as separate but equal at home. And in the military, it was widely known that the Nazis learned how to divide and conquer from studying US slavery and Jim Crow laws, which still existed during this time during World War II. And so after Japan had already agreed to surrender, the US committed the ultimate act of war on nature by dropping the atomic bomb that created a mushroom cloud over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The US military wanted to set a precedent in fighting its next ideological enemy. And here are illustrations by atomic bomb survivors that are a chilling reminder of this crime against humanity. So matsutake is a highly prized edible mushroom that can fetch extravagant prices in Japan, sometimes as high as $1,000 per kilogram. And it's known for its spicy aroma and taste. Some compare it to cinnamon. Mycologist David Aurora describes it as a blend of Red Hots and old gym socks. And they are found in the Pacific Northwest and are on the verge of extinction. And in Japan, as the pine forests have been mostly destroyed, and I just learned recently reading Anna Singh's Mushroom at the End of the World, that because they're so limited on their timber resources, they were importing US timber and introduced a bark beetle that took out even more of the trees that they still had there. And so they hardly ever are able to find the matsutake there. So they end up getting it from a lot of these timber farms in the Pacific Northwest. And there's a movie too, a documentary about like Vietnam vets from the US and then Vietnamese immigrants, like all meeting and doing this work, like collecting these mushrooms in the Pacific Northwest. It's really good. And I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but if that interests you, email me. But it's all about this, focused on the matsutake mushroom. But the first living thing to emerge out of the blasted landscape, according to, and I don't know if this is just from people sharing stories after the atomic bomb, but it was this particular mushroom. And so this is a tarot card from an artist that we had visit us earlier this year, Joe Buckley. He has a mushroom tarot deck, and he lets us know that matsutake reminds us that for every action, there is a reaction. Be mindful of your choices and compassionate towards the choices of others. And so fungi were portrayed as a foreign resource in a planet populated by little green people in distress in a children's science fiction novel, Wonderful Flight to a Mushroom Planet, written by Eleanor Cameron in 1954. So the book was so popular that there was even a follow-up called Stowaway to a Mushroom Planet. And Eleanor was known for publicly speaking out against the Oompa Loompas from the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory book, which were originally portrayed as abused African slaves. And so the pictures and the descriptions of the Oompa Loompas were then revised with artists speaking out. And so she was not far off with her science fiction idea that there were planets ruled by mushrooms, because we now know, and we even have fossils that show us that 420 million years ago, a fungus named Prototaxides ruled the planet and broke things down. And so there's a PBS documentary, short documentary on eons about this particular fungus. So if you Google the name, there's very little, there's a few little things about it on the internet. And so this atomic age of visual arts included a lot of fear-based themes and phobia. Matango is a 1963 Japanese horror movie directed by Ishiro Honda, and it was nearly banned due to the scenes that depicted characters that resembled victims of the atomic bombings. And it was about a group of castaways on an island who were unwittingly altered by the local species of a mutagenic fungus. So yeah, we can watch the trailer here.
Seven young people shipwrecked on a mysterious island. The island was deserted. Not even birds or animals dared to come here. What did they find? Seaweed, fish, and turtle's eggs. Anything we can eat, as well as snakes and lizards. Just let me finish. There's a lot of grass growing around here. You can eat the roots. You can eat the roots of a lot of plants here. Never thought of that, did you? They were driven to the edge of starvation. Food was scarce, and they were forbidden to eat the mushrooms that grew on the island. Fear and hunger turned them against each other. Get you.
But hunger will help me live.
I haven't been hungry since I left the ship.
Mamie. Oh, help me. Help me.
Please, can't we eat the mushrooms now?
That will really be the end of this. Akiko!
I'll have to have a movie night. Watch that one.
Oh my God!
It's coming.
Matungo, the horrible mushroom. Matungo, the vegetable monster. Can they escape the dreaded Matungo? You'll find out when you see Matungo.
All right, so now we're getting into the heavy stuff. Do you guys want to take a quick bathroom break? Or do you guys want to keep going? Good? Keep going? Okay. All right, so before the 60s, the sacred or psychedelic mushrooms were not understood or common in the US. There were a few key events in popular culture that made psychedelic mushrooms ubiquitous in art and in use. And in 1957, Life magazine did a cover story, Seeking the Magic Mushroom, which is a photo essay by amateur mycologist J.P. Morgan, publicist Robert Gordon Wasson, and he's describing his experience taking magic mushrooms in 1955 during a Mazatec ritual with Maria Sabina in Oaxaca, Mexico. And Wasson was one of the first Westerners to participate in this ritual. So Robert and his wife were fascinated by the differences in cultural attitudes towards fungi in Russia. And the couple began their field research learning about mushrooms use in Siberia. And apparently the US State Department took interest in this. And so recently, through a FOIA, or a Freedom of Information Act request by John Marks, a writer, an investigative reporter, it was discovered that Robert Gordon Wasson's trip to Oaxaca was actually funded by the CIA's MK Ultra project. And Wasson was an unwitting participant. And so during the Cold War, there was a lot of funds and resources thrown at finding ways to kind of weaponize nature, like the CIA and all of the alphabet agencies were looking to find chemicals that they could get information from people, destroy or control their minds in order to smear and delegitimize their efforts. And so we still don't know the extent of the program because many of the documents were destroyed or are redacted. And so some of the findings on the MK Ultra program are now dramatized in TV shows and documentaries. And so the first season of the popular Netflix show Stranger Things is about this. Wormwood is also a show on Netflix about, I think it's more about LSD maybe. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting information that people have uncovered about that program. But yeah, it was, another kind of culture or, the war with sort of the Soviet bloc at the time. So they were trying to find lots of different ways to gain information from people, lots of spying. And so One Step Beyond was another television show on ABC. And in the 1961 episode, The Sacred Mushroom, it deals with the discovery of the mind-altering drug that is purportedly able to increase a user's psychic powers. So Newland, the TV show host, travels to Mexico where he met with a local shaman. And it's this sort of reality TV style episode. And it was very controversial and banned from syndication, but you can now watch it on YouTube. And I'm not actually going to watch this one because it's kind of long, but it's kind of weird. Honestly, like if you think about it, it's like, oh, this is like early reality TV, like documentary style. So there was like some things on television like that at a time, but there's some people that think like this is like the first one, kind of more like I'm here, live, doing some magic mushrooms. And so after these major media events and with additional help from people like Alan Watts, Timothy Leary, and beatniks, mushrooms and other psychedelics became ubiquitous and were found in everything from yarn art, cookie jars, pot holders, blacklight posters. And in his memoir, author Tom Robbins talks about the impact of the Life magazine article on turning on Americans to psychedelic mushrooms, including himself. And so the Life magazine article sparked immense interest in this Mazatec ritual practiced among beatniks and hippies, and an interest that proved to be disastrous for the Mazatec community and for Maria Sabina, shown in the mural here. And as the community was besieged by Westerners wanting to experience the magic hallucinations, Sabina attracted attention by the Mexican police, who thought she was dealing drugs to foreigners. And the unwanted attention completely altered the social dynamic of the Mazatec community. And the community blamed Sabina, and she was ostracized in the community and had her house burned down. She says that she regrets it. And of course, Wasson, he contends that he was only trying to contribute to the larger sum of human knowledge. But these were kind of the sort of unintended consequences of the time. And so this mushroom's popularity in art and use happened during the Vietnam War. And a lot of new declassified evidence shows that the federal counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, weaponized and even distributed psychedelics to discredit and criminalize a lot of the anti-war and labor movements. And so these were some of the groups that were targeted. And there's a lot of different information about these a lot of books and things written about these period. So this eventually led to psilocybin being placed under Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. And this really jump-started this war on drugs as we know it today. And it eventually led to mass incarceration, or what some people call today the new Jim Crow. Minorities, poor people, activists were targeted. And we now know that today there are more African-American men in prison than were slaves in 1850. And so we have more people incarcerated per capita than any country in the world, including places with very high populations like China. And so you can see a quote here by Nixon's policy advisor at the time that clearly lays it all out there. Yeah. And so around the same time in 1969, a scientist named Robert Whitaker published the first major revision to the two kingdom classification system. And he proposed that there be 5 kingdoms, this meaning fungi would now have its own kingdom. And so this date is significant, not only because it was the year of the moon landing, but also with such great leaps in one area, the US made a huge stumble backwards with the war on drugs. And so with so little knowledge of mushrooms, a lot of research, not just on psychedelics, other mushrooms was all shut down and mycophobia intensified. And mushroom imagery and art persisted through the 70s, but started to fade and was kind of considered kitsch as time went on. And in the mid-80s, the Japanese company Nintendo introduced their console in the US. And Mario and his brother Luigi travel the Mushroom Kingdom to rescue Princess Toadstool from Bowser. If the player gets a super mushroom, Mario grows to double his size and gains the ability to break bricks above him. The Mario mushroom resembles the Amanita muscaria, which we know, when safely ingested, makes you feel bigger and like flying. So the franchise was so popular, it spun off into many live-action animated movies and more. And Super Mario Brothers isn't the only video game with Nintendo to include fungi creatures with superpowers. There are several characters from Pokemon, Morolol, Shroomish, Fungi, Among Us, Parasect, which looks like an insect infected by a mushroom. And this brings me to the next modern video game, which is now a popular TV show on HBO, or was. The first season is out, done. But this, I'm not going to show this video either, because like everybody knows the premise. Probably who here has seen Last of Us? Yeah, okay. So yeah, it's essentially It started as a video game, and this was a trailer for the video game. The artist is describing like kind of the layers and levels and how the fungus infects humans. It jumps species from insect to humans, and then eventually zombifies people, and they do terrible things and continue to eat humans and continue to spread their spores. But there was also a video game, and I bring it up because it was developed in Austin, called Mushroom Men. I don't think it was very popular. I'm not a gamer though, so I don't really know. There's a follow-up called Trouble. So yeah, if you're into truffles and trouble, there's a game for you. And so I'm assuming everyone is familiar with the artist Banksy, the mysterious street artist. And so this famous street art kind of speaks for itself. And so it was impossible to find any kind of information about it. I think just about him in general. Like, I know more recently he's like had some like more public kind of gimmicks, or publicly talked about in gimmicks. But when I was searching and using like reverse image search and all this sort of stuff, like trying to find something specific about this painting, I was just getting thrown so much merch, like from like everywhere, like Walmart, Amazon, canvas bags, pillows, like you can get anything with this art on it. So yeah. And so Takashi Murakami, considered the Warhol of Japan, is known for his contemporary pop synthesis of fine art and popular culture, particularly his use of boldly graphic and colorful anime and manga cartoon style. And so Murakami became famous in the 90s for his super flat theory or style. And it's a blend of high and low, and his output includes paintings, sculptures, drawings, animations, and even collaborations with Louis Vuitton. And so in the last few decades, and especially with the popularity of these mushrooms, we're seeing, you know, other Japanese artists as well. And so here's a few valuable paintings by Japanese artist Yayoi Kusama, known for her colorful and poppy polka dots. And so Sotheby's estimates the value of, I think, the one on the left to be 2.2 million. And so Yayoi has lived in both the US and Japan, and she was part of a New York counterculture scene in the 60s where they were revolting against the Vietnam War, and they would do things, kind of surrealist type things. They would paint polka dots all over their body. They would be naked and they'd be out in the streets and just trying to like disrupt things, confuse things. And so her early work is said to have influenced Andy Warhol. So the Haas brothers, twin brothers, Simon and Nikolai Haas, run their furniture studio and fabrication, their design build studio in Los Angeles, but they grew up in Austin. And so they created everything from set design to wearable art, masks for Lady Gaga to gold leaf furniture for Louis Vuitton stores. The furniture blurs between art and design, as you can see from the pieces here. So based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, artist Amy Ross is interested in the idea of artist as a mad scientist. She creates art that turns the natural world on its head, morphing flora and fauna together into curious hybrid creatures. And then in Soviet times, there used to be a magazine called America, issued by the US State Department. And one of the articles in the magazine from the mid-70s was called The Most Delicious American Mushrooms. And it describes 17 kinds of exquisite mushrooms in America. And so that's the starting point of the series of watercolor paintings by Nikita Shalimi from the Ukraine. And she also does a similar kind of anthropomorphized mushroom-headed people style using watercolor paint. And she explores the imagery of mushroom cultures living somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Russia. They sprout from the imagination and live in their dreamy, seemingly free and equal, just like the American mushrooms, right? I really like this one. It's my favorite. So Vladimir Grig's individual style originates from Soviet print design in the 50s and 60s, and his graphic series are often saturated with mysticism, characteristic of plots from Russian literature in the early 20th century, as seen here. And so his graphic work even incorporates intricate glass beads, as seen here in this piece, where an amanita is anthropomorphized in a library. It's very meta, right? Doing this talk in a library and then looking at. It's very cool. This is one of my favorites. And so this same concept carries through in this installation by Melissa J. Craig of books shaped Amanita as Amanita muscaria, and it plays with people's mycophobia and mystical relationship with fungus. And the artist parallels that books can be an agent of change, much like mushrooms can be. So using his training as a scientist and his work as an artist, Karsten Haller's primary concerns relate to the nature of human perception and self-exploration. And he has undertaken his many projects that invite the viewer to participate and interaction while questioning human behavior, perception, and logic. His laboratory of doubt embodied in objects ranging from carousels to slippery slides to upside down goggles, often contains colorful, playful, hallucinatory, or darkly humorous overtones in order to provoke experience and reflection. So Anton Korbatov is a young Russian digital artist that paints these beautiful, immersive sci-fi, almost looking like AI art, but this is pre-AI art, inspired kind of conceptual art. And so this is a modern interpretation of the bee mushroom cave painting from Africa that we learned about in the first part. And it's done by a San Francisco artist named John Speaker. And so this cave painting is interpreted by anthropologists as a mushroom shaman buried in his clothes. And when unearthed sometime later, his body was covered with tiny mushrooms growing from his clothes. And so if you've seen the popular TED talk by Jai-Rim Lee of the Infinite Burial Project or the mushroom burial suit, this reminds me kind of her concept. And apparently there have only been, or actually I haven't checked either recently, this is from like 2 years ago, but there's only been one person that's volunteered to be buried in the mushroom suit. And I've also learned a little more too, that it's like more bacterial. But that doesn't stop TV shows from like Hannibal. I don't know if you guys know this show is like a spinoff of Silence of the Lambs. And I think the second episode in the first season, the plot involves the killer who buries the victims alive so they can become fertilizer for his garden of fungus. So the killer turns out to be a pharmacist named Eldon Stamets. who seeks out diabetic patients, and he replaces their insulin with a high dose of sugar that makes, and as we know, like mushrooms really like sugar. I'm like, if only they had a mushroom block program in this town, this would not happen. So yeah, this is some of the art. It's very sci-fi, and I found out too because didn't get to ask Paul Stamets himself, but Lonnie, she was in town for the Texas Mushroom Festival, and I've known her for a couple years. But I asked her if he was consulted on this show, and they're like, no, they never call. They just go with it, science fiction. So Chris Jury is known as an environmental installation artist, and his body of work includes ephemeral assemblies of natural materials, known as kind of bio art, or there's a lot of different names for it. But this 3D sculpture is of a mushroom cloud evoking the atomic bomb, and it's made out of 6,000 pieces of dried mushrooms strung floor to ceiling. So the artist questions the ties between nature and man-made destruction through this visual metaphor. And so this land or ephemeral artist, Sarah from Finland, uses mushrooms as her primary medium, and the compositions are just stunning. And so she doesn't do any, like she just takes photos of them and sells prints, but she just leaves everything for other hikers to find. And so she finds the forest as her temple and studio. So here's another British artist who is known for these oversized mushroom sculptures made from polyurethane, where he places them high on buildings, and they can be found in New York, London, Barcelona, Berlin, Cape Town, Los Angeles. I've never actually seen one. Has anybody seen these anywhere traveling? And so this is another kind of fun artist, like chalk artist. And he does these like 3D chalk paintings. And this one's called Virtual Transition, Fungi Powering a Digital Motherboard. And so this is a sound mixed media installation by a group called the Mycelium Network Society, which includes a group of artists and biohackers from all over the globe. And this installation taps into sound of the Ganoderma mushroom, the reishi, using signal processors and contact microphones. And these electronic devices detect changes within the living mycelial atoms and transmits this information across radio frequencies, which is spatially and experienced as audio within the installation. So it can be tied to like any kind of like MIDI sound. And when this came out, like, I don't think Plant Wave was yet a thing. I know there were a lot of like people experimenting with tools like this, but does everybody know Plant Wave? Yeah, so it's like a fun little device you can hook up to plants, and it measures the frequencies of change, like in the electrical frequency, because all living things have like electrical energy running through it, and so it detects those changes and then maps it to a MIDI file, and you can compose any kind of music. So it's kind of like an EKG. It measures like the EKG, the waveform of a living thing, and then you can make any kind of sound. Choose whatever instrument you want to play. So he uses them. We did a program with him where we went to a mushroom farm and we just played a bunch of different mushrooms. But yeah, called Plant Wave. There's a couple of other brands. But yeah, so this was a fun project from several years back before the pandemic. You can see the Ganoderma. I actually have some of that same mushroom in the back. The mushroom of immortality. But yeah, we can, since I don't have good audio, I won't play it here, but so the artist or the author of Entangled Life, a book that's come out in the last couple years, he did this sort of self-referential marketing campaign where they inoculated the book with the oyster mushroom spores, and then it grew the mushrooms. And then he worked with one of the, probably the earliest known, at least that I know of, like sound artist. His name's Michael Prime. He was doing this bio music back in the 80s. And so they did this fun little promo of the book making sounds. And so, yeah, so it was very cool to see, cool little marketing gimmick. But yeah, I'm just going to summarize everything. That's kind of the end. And then we can have a discussion if everybody wants to stick around, just talk about our thoughts, because there's a lot thrown out here, but I want to hear what you all think and kind of share some of the questions that came up for me when I was doing my own discovery, learning about all of mushrooms and how they're portrayed in art. So I'm just going to end with the summary here. So in nature, nothing exists alone, but man is a part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself. So that quote came from Rachel Carson, who wrote the book Silent Spring, which, if you've read that book, like it was a response to DDT poisonings, which happened everywhere. And I just learned from my friend Anne that there was like a huge fish. There's like a river that was poisoned by this chemical as well. What was that? The Colorado River, yeah. And there's an entire fish die-off of this DDT poison. And so it's known too that like women and multi-generationally, a big reason why we have so much prevalence of breast cancer is from DDT too, and it can be passed on epigenetically, generationally, so it reverberates, right? So and it all like kind of ties together in this sort of war on drugs, us chemically thinking we can extract, take things, rearrange things, dominate things, and reconstitute things. And we don't think about the full reverberations, especially knowing, me being close and being kin with fungi, knowing we only know about like 10%. Like, how could we know that what we're doing, right? Like, we only know about 10% of microbes and fungi, even though we know a lot of plants and things like that. And we know how to like extract things out of them and rebrand them into like all these like fancy medicines and things. We don't know everything, right? Especially our soils and all the living things in the soil. So, which is our soul, ends up being us, right? We like everything grows from the soil. So it eventually makes its way into our biomes, right? And so early artifacts were in conflict with what is considered art today. And for many reasons, the values, identities, and deities of larger tribal groups were represented through reverence towards nature and its resources. Spiritual artifacts were replaced with art that represents self-identity and materialism. The expectation today is that art is an expression of individual identity or some sort of brand or something that can be valuable, auctioned off to the highest bidder, which ends up being, as we all know, just a tax deduction. And so it is an insider game, as we all know, like full of price fixing and manufactured scarcity. And so that's like a completely different topic, but so yeah. And so after the emerald tablets and Hermetism was reintroduced to Europe, the spiritual connections with nature were largely replaced with material quests, and Western colonization, or the so-called Age of Discovery, began. Some alchemists interpreted Hermetic philosophy as a way of control and dominating nature. Western civilizations turned towards materialism and quests of accumulation of gold in a search for immortality, which became kind of a new religion per se. So monotheistic Western societies pride themselves on our understanding of material science, yet hardly understand the fungi kingdom or the relationship with dark matter and consciousness of all living things. And so fungi is more than a metaphor for mystery, fear, and the unknown. Similar to Homo sapiens searching for the philosopher's stone, mushrooms and lichens recycle, transmute, and transform. Fungi are the ultimate transmuters. And so we have the ability to transmute one atomic element into another for the purpose of creating mushroom clouds that kill billions of living things with the push of a button. The internal combustion engine, fungicide, pesticides used in industrial agriculture are also praised as material successes, but are some of the most destructive forces on this planet and to our health. The ruling class continues to create existential threats using the good versus evil binary. The war on drugs, the war on terror, the war on viruses. It's always going to be one. Despite all of this, art has a way of healing. We consciously and unconsciously tell stories in hopes to enlighten those that try to dominate nature. The end. So yeah, so these were just kind of some of the questions that kind of came up for me, but I'm happy to we can take questions now or go through these, and then I can take more questions from people. But yeah. Yeah.
Since you mentioned the Nintendo thing.
Yeah.
The Zelda game, it's a whole underworld.
Oh
Huge.
my gosh. Okay. I think, yeah, someone told me about this recently, and there's like a few people in the society that want to do just a video games, like mushrooms and video games, which I think would be a really fun presentation. Yeah.
One of the Star Treks, there's
Oh, yes.
mycelium.
Yes.
Space mycelium network, and there's.
Yes, I heard about this. I haven't watched it. We're talking about, for people online, I'm doing a live stream too, but for people online, we're talking about the Zelda game and also the Star Trek, the latest season, Voyager. Yeah. Well, in September, so someone from Ruiz reached out because they're doing like a Star Trek Voyager night, like meetup kind of thing. And so we're going to come and talk about the mushrooms part of it, but it's on my list of things to watch this summer while it's really hot, because I haven't, and I wouldn't say that I'm a Trekkie. So I'm going to have a little imposter syndrome maybe, but I'll bring my boyfriend. He's a Trekkie and he has a Spock. It's pretty great. Yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, like spirits and alcohol, like adding mushrooms to alcohol. I'm sorry, what's your question? Oh, go ahead, keep going. You can keep asking your question. Sorry. Oh, you can keep asking your question. Oh. Yeah. Oh, okay. Interesting. I'll have to look it up. Wonder if it has any. I see. Yeah. Oh, wow. So does anybody, let's see. All right.
Side by side. The illustration.
Mhm. Like no discussion this time. Everybody's like ready to go. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, so Joseph brought blocks. I think they're in the back of his truck. Joseph, do you want to, she's asking about the blocks. Are they in the back of your truck? You might be able to just grab them out. How's it going? Good to see you again. Yeah.
Jonathan says hi.
Oh, good, good. Yeah. Hi. Nice to meet you. Oh, good. Yeah, wasn't it fun? I'm gonna end this live stream. Ugh. Ugh. Yeah, thank you guys for coming. Yeah.